Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Leanne Zinsmeister. I'm the managing editor at Nation's Restaurant News. I am joined today by Claire Conahan from Data Central, and we are just going to have a conversation about how to predict menu trends before they even happen. So, Claire, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. I know you've got a little presentation ready to go, so let's get to it.
Sure. Yeah, we'll get into predicting trends before they happen. So I think we can just go on to the next slide so we can see some information while I talk through what we have here. So we're going to be looking at trends, predicting trends before they happen. And the first thing to know is sort of where all of this information is coming from. What we'll be looking at primarily is from Data Central's menu trends platform. And here we have, it's 4,800 restaurants, half chains and half independents, which allows us to get a really nice read on both trends that are happening and things that maybe have not quite hit yet. And what you'll see on nearly every slide is this measure of penetration. And that simply means percent of restaurants that offer, the logic being if you are adding it to menus, so that growth number that we see here, it's probably trending or starting to appeal. People want to offer it. Maybe people are starting to order it at restaurants. If it's falling off of menus, the opposite is true. So that's where all the information comes from and the thought process behind it. So here we have the sauces and flavors on app, entree, side menus, dishes, and beverages. And this is what's already happening, right? This is before we get to predicting trends before they happen. This is what's already happening. And hopefully for anyone watching along, these things should look familiar to you. Lots of these are things we've been talking about for a number of years, but they still continue to have growth both over, for the most part, over the past 4 years, as well as the past 12 months. There's a couple things you'll start to see. And the reason we look at both of those numbers, and we'll do that throughout this conversation, is because it lets you know if things are starting to slow. If you see growth in both of those areas still, it's a really strong active trend or starting to gain some ground. So here you can see that plant-based burgers is starting to maybe have reached its peak. And that's just at restaurants. There's could be different trends for something like hard seltzer also starting to flatten out. You might see different trends happening with those particular products outside of restaurants. Okay, so we saw some trends that are actively happening, but before we look at all the stuff of where we're predicting what could be next, I want to sort of set the stage a little bit about why it's appropriate to look that small. So Nashville Hot is a really great example for that. That's something that didn't hit that 1% threshold, which is what we often use as this trend is already happening. Our platform defaults to the 1%, though you can certainly get into the weeds, and that's what we'll be doing to look under that 1%. You can see that Nashville Hot didn't even hit that threshold to show up on that list until 2019. And you certainly would have wanted to know about Nashville Hot much sooner than that. And if we were looking at this predicting trends before they happen methodology, you would have caught it probably more like 2015 or so, possibly even earlier if we looked in different realms. So this is, don't dismiss small sample trends. Lots of times when people use our products, our solutions, they'll say, oh, I want to make sure it's established. And there are certainly reasons to look well above that threshold if you're, different strategies, different product lines. Makes perfect sense. But there's also reasons to look tiny because we need a lot of time to figure out how to put it in a supply chain. So this lets us do that by applying these rules.
A question about Nashville Hot, Claire. I was fascinated by this slide because we saw KFC launch Nashville Hot Chicken back in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of a two-parter. Is it common for big brands to be on the forefront of trends like this? Should we be looking to big brands and like limited time offers and things like that for the trends? And is it usual that they did that in 2016 and it still took another 3 years or so to catch on more widely?
So much in that. And that's a great question. That's like a great example. That's one of those things where you will often see those big brands, if it makes sense in their wheelhouse, grab something much earlier, right? So a Nashville Hot is typically a chicken breast. I think that same year also, I want to say like Captain D's also introduced like a hot fish. So if it's within their product, it makes sense to grab it earlier. And so that can help propel it faster, right? So that's why it's even more important to find these things earlier. It's actually fairly common, and more that's something that we're saying is that trends move so much faster now. Like it's one or two of those brands will grab it, and then the next thing you know, everyone knows about it. You should have already had it on your menu. You really needed to be tracking it the year before at a minimum, if not earlier. And so that is kind of common. And LTOs are a great place to look for those things that might keep going, or to see how appealing they are or how they could be adapted for a wider audience. So I think that answers that.
Definitely.
Okay, and then also on this slide, you can also see that even those little, even though the trend is fairly established now, there's our menu cast solution suggests that it will continue to, and this is our AI that predicts where trends may go in the future. There's still some predicted growth for Nashville Hot moving forward. Okay, so what should we be watching now? Now we're going to go look smaller, right? So I validated we can look small, and that's okay. What happens if we look there, and do we start to see things that maybe we don't know are happening yet? Sometimes here you'll see things that might be happening in other spaces. It's particularly common for sauces and flavors, certain ones to show up at retail before they hit restaurants, or it might not make sense for a wide application on the menu. So something like everything bagel spice is something that's still under 1% on menus, but it's, a lot of places at the retail front. But you'll also see some newer things here that aren't happening as much in other spaces, and also get hints at how to make something maybe more approachable. So this milk dumpling term that's growing in dishes is actually gulab jamun, and how they're describing it. I don't know that that's that's the way that's going to make it continue to move through the trend cycle, but that's something they're tinkering with to describe it and make it a little bit more approachable on the menu. And then we also have things like Japanese curry, which hasn't shown particular growth over the past 12 months. We don't have much to work with there, but the 4-year growth is very strong. So that's another one that we might see continuing. And then in beverage, once you're going this small, it is really important to look at those menu examples. In the other spaces, you might just, I know what that is. I can guess how it's used. When you're going tiny, you really need to look at each and every term to better understand what's happening, because you don't want to put blackened on a chart or make a business choice about blackened in beverage without knowing what's in there. So in this case, it's mostly a branded whiskey from Metallica, but also blackened rims on Bloody Marys, on proteins within that. So there's some more broad potential for how that could be utilized.
Quick question, or I guess a couple questions about some of those like specific trends, not to get too specific because I know we're talking broadly here. But is retail a good place for operators to look for like coming flavor trends? Like, for example, with that everything bagel spice, or is that just like an anomaly?
I mean, I would say, and in my experience of doing this for 15 or so years, we've always said trends start at restaurants. That's the whole point of what we do, and I would say that mostly that it remains true. And we'll talk through in a little bit some other ways you might be able to evaluate that. It certainly doesn't hurt to look at things at retail. In some categories, trends do come faster from there than they might from restaurants. So we certainly consider that more something like beverage. Of course, that's a retail driven trend. Lots of the kind of healthy is not something you see as much at restaurants. So if it's hitting restaurants, it's super important that you take note for those health forward trends. And sauces and flavors are another one where it kind of is half and half where you might want to look. So if you see it on the retail shelves and you've not yet seen it much in restaurants, or you're also seeing that product made, it could indicate a bigger trend, something like Japanese barbecue. Like all three of these are actually, all four of those top ones are things you can find retail products for already. It might be, though, that there's not a food service product for it that's easy to get from a distributor. So it might be an opportunity for certain food service manufacturers.
That makes sense. And then are you seeing more trends that have like strong visual appeal? I'm wondering how much like the rise of social media, because I see at least one thing in each of these columns that like, I'm like, oh, that's pretty.
Yeah, that is another, and that's another thing we'll talk about in a little bit, is like all those fads that you see on social media, how do you know if it's a fad? You should, if you can jump fast, you should almost always jump on the fad. But if you can't, do I need to care about this? And that's one of those like core attributes you should be thinking about. Is it very visually appealing? Does it offer some benefit beyond maybe its flavor? Something like ube is absolutely beautiful. That it's also tasty. So like if you have both of those things going, there's certainly a visual component. Okay, now when we do go tiny, you do have to think about which thing to focus on, right? So here, what I did is I looked at different versions of Carolina barbecue, looking all the way back. We know that's a big trend, another one that people are seeing and talking a lot about, particularly the Carolina Gold. And how did those trend lines happen? So the purple trend line is Carolina barbecue, which includes both of these as well as any unspecified Carolina. So it doesn't tell you if it's Carolina Gold, which is the southern version, or North Carolina. And then we have the other trend lines. These all might be good options depending on what you do. But you can see that Carolina Gold took off faster. The trend line very early on doesn't necessarily have any huge giveaway that that's the one you should have focused on. That's where you have to kind of have a little bit of expertise and think about how it would fit in another place. So at the same time that Carolina Gold started to take off, we were seeing a lot of like whole grain mustards, interest overall in mustards, lots of flavor iterations for that were starting to happen. So it would make sense that when operators were looking to add that extra barbecue flavor, they were thinking, oh, there's actually this interesting one that already integrates mustard. It has a different color than standard barbecue sauce, and it has a different flavor profile. So that might be the one I want to watch. Adding North Carolina barbecue sauce, which is more tomato based, is not going to have the same diversity for an operator to add that. It's just very similar to probably the other barbecue sauces they have because it's ketchup based. Kansas City, the most well-known varietal, is tomato based. It's a little too similar, whereas that Carolina Gold gives something different and unique. Okay, so where else do we look? We've established we need to look tiny. That helps. We've thought about maybe some ways to know which tiny thing matters more if there's a bunch that are very similar. But where else can we think of things? We discussed restaurants are, where generally trends come from. Specifically, it does tend to be those independents because those big chains, unless it makes a ton of sense, like Nashville Hot and KFC, it's just really hard to have the supply chain to roll out a brand new item. And it's very risky and very expensive to get it wrong. And so independents tend to do things faster. And watching those trends can help you see what might make sense to apply to your product lines or to your restaurant. So what I did here is we looked at independents. In our database, that's defined as 1 or 2 units within the platform. That's our definition. And we have a bunch of terms here. And then we have to think through which of these might make sense. So something like elk, maybe it'll be big in a couple years, but there's certainly supply chain challenges. There's regional considerations. There's anyone with more hunting background finds it more appealing. But when you look in our other platform, which rates things, it has very high appeal once people try it. It adds a little more specificity from venison, which is usually considered a higher end protein. So it could make sense depending on what you do. You could certainly do like an elk burger, but some of these others might have faster, easier applications. So something like wasabi mashed potatoes, which speaks to that everything old is new again trend. That's one that was like the way to literally spice up your mashed potatoes about, a decade and a half, 2 decades ago. And here it is coming back. And then there's some other good examples here that you could see really working in different places. Something like braided is usually just a call out to hinting at shaped breads, might mean home made in the restaurant, or it could just be a way to like literally braid in flavor. You might have like pieces of like garlic or something braided in.
What makes something really take off? Like I'm looking at that top one there with 920% growth in a single year. How does something like that happen?
I mean, these are small bases. That could be a growth. In that case, that's nearly quite a lot. It could be that there was 1 or 2 restaurants, and all of a sudden there's 12, 15 now. But it can still matter. So that's paratha that's been made with whole wheat. So it may very well just be that maybe unknown to me, I don't personally know the background of access to whole wheat flour or pre-made paratha, but maybe the latcha has some development that causes that. Otherwise, it can be as simple as like just a couple people do it, and all of a sudden that number starts to show up. But that's one where you think about it makes sense that whole wheat would all of a sudden grow. Indian food is really going through a bit of a renaissance. They're feeling like you can kind of change things up. It's possible people were ordering it and they're like, oh, do you have a whole wheat version? And they're like, oh, we could do that. We eat that at home. Why didn't we ever have that at our restaurant? And so it might just be as simple as that for something like that particular one. Okay, so we've talked about the independence and why we want to look at them. Here's another kind of indicator of that, and then another suggestion of where we could look. So we have independence here on this chart is in the green. And we see that it just hits that 1% threshold in 2015, which is actually the same year that we see massive growth at the US innovators. So another place that you could look for some new and interesting things is to think about our US innovators. And those are exactly what it sounds like, just places that are known for doing interesting and different things. Another way to cut the data is to look very tiny at those specific restaurants. And then similar idea, mostly the same sort of universes on this chart. Another thing to do, and this is sort of relating to the whole wheat bread thing, is to look within the cuisine type. The trends from there start to shift first in their cuisine type. You're not going to see, cacio pepe way back in 2013 at an American restaurant. It just wouldn't have made sense. But we did start to see, it was already on 2% of Italian menus at that time. And in 2014, it would have hit that. We tend to look at about a 10 restaurant threshold when we're going tiny, though you could go even tinier. But it hit that threshold in 2014. And then you start to see it taking off. When you're starting to see it doubling or more than doubling it within its cuisine type, that's a hint that you might see it outside of its cuisine type soon enough. And a way to see that hint, it looks so tiny, but that American cuisine restaurant in kind of that teal color, you can start to see that start to raise up a little bit. Once American cuisine are almost always the first to make it approachable. So you want to kind of layer that approach of looking what's happening at global cuisine, looking within a specific one, and then is that able to be applied to other restaurants, specifically those new American type places. Okay, this is like my warning that I always want to tell new customers of ours or anyone who's looking at some of our stuff is you really want to stay in your wheelhouse, right? You want to consider focus on your stuff. It's you have so much to do. I'm a dessert manufacturer. I want to see what's happening on desserts. Can you please show me only desserts? Which is obviously going to be more quickly actionable, but we're in the business of finding new and exciting things. So this is a cautionary tale to not just focus on your thing. Maybe you were, I don't know, a cracker manufacturer or someone who does different flavors, and you'll be like, cacio e pepe, that's a pasta, but not anymore. So just try to think broadly. Don't think just of your category because you never know what interesting things might be around the fringes of it. And that brings this item as flavor trend, which is one of those bigger themes that we're seeing in food and beverage now, which is that a bunch of stuff that used to be perceived as just an item, they become flavors. And that's like a fun way to mix up a food and make sort of have people try something new. There's, chip manufacturers are great at this, but we're seeing it all across different product lines. Nashville Hot is a good example. It started at KFC as the chicken. That's what we're known for, but now it's on a lot of stuff. And these are all some examples of things that are growing that we might have started to see. There's hot chicken, something like London Fog is certainly having a moment. Caramel corn, there's even in Chicago a brand that does caramel corn beer. So all of these can be used more broadly if you think about from the category. Just consider things more broadly than necessarily I don't make beverage or dessert, so mango nut doesn't matter to me. It could be a mango nata yogurt, or it could be a mango nata dressing. There's lots of ways to make these things work for you. And then it's all kind of leading up to the menu adoption cycle, which is a product that Data Central has, and we'll see one in a moment here. But the idea with these, and we can actually, I don't know that you need to read this nitty gritty in here, but the idea is that things start in inception, right? That makes sense. And that's what this whole journey is about, predicting trends before they happen. That's inception. We might even say pre inception, but we're starting to put those on these menu adoption cycles because you need to know things a little bit before they happen sometimes. But that's going to be your global independents, fine dining restaurants, or on the retail side, very specific locations like a farmer's market might have a new type of produce or something. Adoption is where things really start to get going, hence the little rocket symbol. It starts to be integrated in a bunch of different ways. It may start to be a little watered down, not a ton, but you have to make it more approachable to keep it going. So those are going to be your fast casual restaurants or casual dining independents, pretty much anywhere you go for like a night out with friends. That's adoption. And then we have proliferation. This is typically where the chains grab it, your quick service chains and your casual dining chains. That's usually who falls here, though they are dabbling more and more in adoption, certainly for limited time offers. And then ubiquity, it's ubiquitous. You can find it anywhere.
Claire, do you have a sense of how many or like what percentage of flavors make it to like each stage? Because like not like we were talking about elk, and I can't imagine elk like being ubiquitous at any point, but do you have a sense of how many?
We've tracked it or kind of like put some numbers around it at varying moments. It's a little hard as the person who does the main development of these. We try to specifically not put too much that's in inception that doesn't seem like it would keep going. So that is kind of an inherent bias that we build into it. Though there's some stuff that you might want to do something super early that's not going to keep moving and just know what's happening. We used to say, I think it was something like 20 or 30% make it all the way through, but so much has changed in the industry that I would have to like go back and look at it. So many things that seemed like very inception are actually starting to move well beyond inception. Something like bone marrow, which we always that was like the quintessential not going to move. And now you might see it on a burger. So I don't know. I think it really depends now. And then this is one of them. This is a menu adoption cycle for savory sauces and flavors. And I chose this one because it has a million words on it. No, I chose this one because I think it's one that can apply across a lot of categories. And there's something for most people within this one. But there's a lot of fun stuff in here. An idea of pretty much everything that we've talked about as far as looking under that 1% threshold is going to fall into that inception space. There's some things that might fall elsewhere. Something like a Havar, you can see it in adoption. A couple retail brands have something they might call it a red pepper paste, but it's pretty close to that product. And now into the important part of a little less within our tools, but thinking through other areas. It's hard to avoid talking about fads when you're talking about trends. We used to always say, our things help you identify what's a trend versus a fad? But fads are so important now, and they do show up in menu data now. And often for many years, they both come very quickly and go away, but sometimes have a lot of lasting power. And this shows from our mid-year trends report that 67% of consumers actually want to see even more short-term trends at restaurants and retail. So definitely do not ignore those short-term trends, or if you will, fads. They have definitely some appeal. And these are kind of our rules that we use to determine if something is a trend versus a fad. The kind of classic questions. Does it address a new consumer truth? Is it going to is it driven by new technology? Did it come to be organically, or is it just, one person? If that one person has a lot of influence, maybe that's an organic growth. And then is it adaptive, versatile? Can we do a lot of different things with this? Fads can always still be relevant. My personal rule of thumb is if I can group them into that themed bucket, colorful things. If it falls into that bucket, probably worth at least paying attention to. Ways to make easy, healthy food from home. maybe worth looking into, just kind of thinking about the broader themes behind it. And these are some examples of the importance of data when we are making those decisions of if something's a long-term trend or a fad. This used to be a question way back when, before we did our bigger trend reports, we did these quarterly reports, and I thought it'd be fun to look back and see some things that operators thought were fads. And maybe they were fads for those operators. That's important to know. Like, you probably aren't, not everyone's going to be a ramen concept, but you might want to serve ramen. Not everyone needs to have coconut water, but actually, it's not very hard to add it to your operation. Some of them even are shelf stable. So there are reasons to think about these things and what they might be, trend or fad. In many cases, only a third of operators thought these would be a long-term trend. And we're still talking about all of these things, and the list goes on and on. So data can help us make these types of decisions.
Is there like a length of time that you would consider like something to be a fad versus like something more long term? Like if it lasts like less than 2 years, is it a fad, or does the length of time it's popular not play into it as much?
That's another one that I feel like has changed over time. I feel like fads used to be really quite short. Like it would be like you'd see something, and it would be one particular item maybe a decade and a half ago, and it would be everything everybody talked about for just a little bit. I feel like they last longer now. Maybe, yeah, 2 years does sound pretty good. It could be even longer because of the way that content is shared now. Videos are, you might find something, it feels really new to you. It showed up in your feed, and it's actually like a 2-year-old video. When you're like, I just discovered this. And you're like, actually, no, you didn't. I do think they last a little bit longer now. And I don't know if you picked 2 years. I don't know that I had a number, but that sounds like a pretty
Just
good
pulled
number.
it out as an example. I think my consumer brain thinks of a fad as like very much a flash in the pan, but I think the way you're framing it will be comforting to a lot of operators too, who might think, "Oh, I don't have time to jump on a TikTok trend," but it's like you might. It could be around for longer than you think.
Yeah, and if it makes sense for your operation and for your customer, I think they really can have some longer term. Like that picture had the like mini pancake cereal, which was like 4 years ago now. Like we're still talking about it. It's a unique example, but there's a
Wow.
ton of those unique examples. So it's not that unique of an example. There's a lot of them. All right, and then this is a little nod to another way to look at stuff. So far, we've looked at all of our menu platform information from that solution. We have another one where we track consumer affinity for products. And this is sort of another interesting data point, right? You have how things sell at retail, which is generally not something we dabble in. And then we have things that happen at restaurants. But there's just also stuff that's like opportunities waiting for either side, right? And those are things where awareness and affinity are actually outpacing your restaurant and retail offerings. There might be reasons for that. Again, supply chain, nobody's made it yet. Someone's about to introduce it. But when we look at these things that are on fire, just massive awareness growth over the past 2 years is what this shows. There's lots of good stuff that we could innovate on in here. And this can also be indicators of when that old is new again thing is coming back, because that younger generation swings this number. So you might see something, there's a couple where you're like, oh, we're gaining an awareness of pot pie, I think is one that's a little further down, where you're like, pot pie is gaining an awareness? That's bizarre. And then you dig in, and it's that a younger consumer has started to become aware, and it's just enough to actually make the total number start to tick up. So these are the first trend lines that look flat. These are I've been talking about the like everything comes back around. These in particular are ones that I have seen. The crab rangoon is a good example of that younger generation. We actually saw that awareness pop up. I was like, crab rangoon? It's been declining or flat on menus for the better part of a decade. How strange. But now it can be a crab rangoon pizza, or it's something else. That's also true of these other items that there's a ton of new patty melt LTOs, and they're all getting huge, like positive ratings from consumers. Just these things that seem like they would have been stale a couple years ago are gaining some new life. And we can do that analysis too. I didn't put it on a slide here, but I saw the egg rolls are kind of, it's a little up, down, starting to tick up. And I was like, oh, what's happening in there? And it's like Southern style brisket egg rolls, which is definitely a different way of doing that product. So it might come back, but it may not look quite the same. The French dip may actually be a burrito sandwich. It could vary.
Kind of a similar question to the last one, but is there a length of time after which you start to expect to see some of those come back around? Like with fashion, how it's like every 20 years?
I think so. I think it is like with fashion, it's almost exactly that 20 years, though just like with fashion, I think it's pacing a little faster, right? Stuff that like was just popular 10 or 15 years ago is starting to come back. Like things that I pulled in my very first data sets, like lots of those things like the wasabi mashed potatoes we're seeing come back. So I think it did used to be 20 or so years. You can think back to like appetizers of the 90s versus those in the 70s versus those like kind of that cyclical nature. I think that's true of food too. And then this slide, this is a bold move. We never do this with our data because generally we're supporting our clients to find new and exciting things to do with the product. It's hard to look at numbers that show something declining. That's not fun. Nobody wants to see their product on this list. But all hope is not lost. I don't think we should be scared of this list. There's plenty of stuff that was declining, the patty melt and the egg roll, and there's still new life there. You can still do fun stuff with it. It doesn't mean that it's over. Fried chicken was stable for a long, long time, and now it's fried chicken, and it has tons of innovation. So I don't think we need to fear this. So here are some sauces and flavors that are showing some decline, as well as some dishes that are showing some decline. And some thoughts, there's the alar romesco. What if we change that tomato pesto to be just a different kind of iteration, probably similar keeping back of house, similar pantry plan for someone at home. If they've stopped purchasing tomato pesto, we can switch gears and offer these types of products. Or just thinking of how to reboot the product. Like an apple salad, I said, are we ready for a Waldorf reboot? And then I was just doing some work the other day, and I saw it growing, and I was like, there it is. My Waldorf reboot is coming for me. So I think looking at these declining things and thinking how to turn them around rather than hide from them is probably a good approach. Okay. And then here is how we do that. We can drill into any term. So we can drill into bacon dressing / vinaigrette. It's not looking so great, but how can we make it happen? Here are the ways that it's a little bit more appealing. It used to be more of a side salad. Now we're making it more of a main dish with something like chicken. That's another retro favorite, ready for a rebound. And then corn chowder. Pretty classic. It was not one of our growing items. It's, top declining, but there are pockets of growth within it. So if we add bacon, of course, makes everything better for many consumers, or adding a little bit of a more unique flavor to it, like Southwestern, or just really leaning into the starchy, comforting feel by adding potato or elevating it with some crab. And here's some examples of how those could look. I actually, here we found these menu items. This is how it could be elevated and made fresh. Let's find some people doing that. So you have kind of a middle America space of Black Oak Grill in Branson, Missouri. And they have, their Pinot infused cranberries with smokehouse bacon, all with a warm bacon vinaigrette. And it certainly looks like a heartier option than maybe the classic side salad. Similarly, we have that corn chowder with those Southwestern components. This one's a small, I think a mid-sized chain actually, and they have all the call outs to all of this healthy aspects as well. So they've managed to get that creamy feel, but it's still dairy free. And that's everything. So hopefully we all learned a little bit in predicting some trends before they happened, maybe even found one that might make sense for the work that we're currently doing. But I appreciate everyone's time.
I definitely learned a lot. So thanks again, Claire, for joining me today and walking us through those things.